Did Americans really stop getting smarter? Are we even getting less intelligent? Or are we actually still getting smarter and smarter with every generation like we used to? For the first 200 years of American education, something important was always rising, like literacy rates, graduation rates, IQ test scores, average years spent in school. But what about the last 50 years? Is our education system still improving? Or is it stagnating? Or is it getting worse? What's the scientific evidence? This is not a simple question, but it's a high-stakes question. It's popular to make fun of Americans and claim that we're dumb and getting dumber. But in reality, if that were true, then that would be very scary in a world that is becoming more and more complex. And it would be a complete reversal of American educational history in which Americans got smarter and smarter with every generation. So in this video, we're going to look at the evidence and ask the question, are Americans on average any smarter than we were 50 years ago? Or is it the opposite of that? When I say smart or educated, I'm not talking about innate intelligence or anything like that. I'm only talking about how prepared a person's mind is to thrive in a complex society. And with that definition, if we step back and look at the world history of education, two trends are clear. The first trend is that as societies have been getting more and more complex, they have also been getting better and better educated for centuries. 1,000 years ago, China was probably the most formally educated country in the world, with about 5 to 10% of its people literate. But then came the Renaissance. And Renaissance Italy, places like Florence and Milan and Venice, out-educated China and became the new most educated center of the world, with 10 to 20% of the Italian speakers spending some time in formal education. Then in the 16th century, Northern Europeans set a new record. In the Netherlands and England and Scotland, basic literacy rates shot up above 50% for the first time ever in Europe. Then in the 19th century, the USA became the best in the world at this crazy new trend called public education. And by 1870, 90% of American children were going to primary school. Once again, a new world record, and that was before the public high school became a thing. The USA led the world in that movement as well. So again, the first trend is that over the long run, we have been getting more and more formally educated. But the second trend is a bit of a bummer. Because what we see again and again is that once a country or a culture has enjoyed being the most educated population in the world and all the benefits that that entails, at some point they decide this is good enough. Education is an expensive pain in the butt. And so the generations that were aggressive about educational advancement are always, eventually, replaced by generations that worry more about overinvestment in education. They fail to make future generations even smarter than they were. After slow but steady educational progress, the Chinese stagnated for many centuries, and by 1900, they were ridiculously behind most of the Western world. The Italians did the same thing. Later, the Netherlands and the English also stagnated for a long time. All of them lost their most educated nation's status eventually. Until now, there have been no exceptions to this trend. And 50 years ago, the USA might just have become the latest one to join this elite club of education leaders who turned into stagnators. And if so, that would explain a lot about the last 50 years. And it could tell us what we can now expect, because we know what happened to those countries when they stagnated educationally. Cultural, economic, and political decline go hand in hand with educational stagnation in a complexifying world. Decline and decay are what came for the Song Dynasty, Renaissance Italy, the Dutch Republic, and the British Empire. And in the long run, that's what's at stake when we ask whether Americans are becoming more intelligent now, less intelligent, or just holding steady. To answer the question, we'll look at test scores, graduation rates, and average number of years spent in school. Does any of this evidence tell us clearly that we're still in a period of educational progress? First, the test scores. Are you ready? At least before the pandemic, according to the National Assessment of Education Progress, the test scores for 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds were sort of, slowly going up. This is good news. And it would be great news, except that the test scores of 9-year-olds and 14-year-olds are just unimportant to the question we're asking. Hey, I'm sorry, but the truth is, my dear 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds, that you don't have jobs, you don't vote, you aren't really the major thought leaders and influencers of our culture, you don't run our institutions, so your test scores just don't make that much of a difference, in the right now moment. But I do believe that children are our future. And so one day the improvement that we see in test scores of 9 and 13-year-olds might be important if they could keep those improvements through to adulthood. And this is where we come to some bad news. The NAEP also tests 17-year-olds. And the test scores of 17-year-olds have been completely flat since the beginning of the tests 50 years ago. Zero progress. Not for boys, not for girls. No progress for white kids, black kids, or Latinos. Stagnation in math, stagnation in reading. Those same 14-year-olds who were scoring 10 points higher than earlier generations of 14-year-olds became 17-year-olds who were scoring no higher than earlier generations of 17-year-olds. They're not getting dumber, just not getting any smarter. And this trend for 17-year-olds is true no matter what tests we look at.
We have the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And then more recently, we have a couple international tests that allow us not only to know how our students are doing over time, but to compare our students to German students or British students or what have you. And so we can follow these tests over time and see what's been happening.
So what did you find over 50 years of studying that data?
Well, we find a remarkable thing. Nothing has changed. Kids seem to be getting better up till middle school over time. But if we look at kids at the end of schooling, at the end of secondary schooling, we see the same flat story for at least the last quarter century.
But there's still hope. 17-year-olds are also not the end-all be-all. There's a lot of learning that can happen after we turn 17. Adults are the ones who are in the job market right now and voting and controlling our media, our academia, and our families, and our governments. And luckily, we've been testing actual adult skills for the past 30 years with a whole variety of tests with fun acronyms like NALS and IELTS and ALL and PIAC. And what do all of these tell us? Are adults getting smarter? Well, according to literacy and math test scores, American adults are not getting dumber or smarter. We're holding steady. Steady at 54% of us reading at the 5th grade level or lower. And reading at the 5th grade level or lower as an adult does make it harder to thrive in a rapidly complexifying society. But hey, at least there's no evidence that we're getting less smart. Not yet. It's time to look at another test, the IQ test. The intelligence quotient test was invented in 1905, and we've been administering the IQ test to millions of Americans now for nearly that long. So we have over a century of data on our average IQs. And the exciting news is that average IQs went up by a lot in the 20th century. As Americans doubled the number of years that they spent in school in the 20th century, IQs also rose by 30 points, and that is enormous. But sadly, they stopped going up, and then they started going down. According to most scholars who study IQs, American adults are now becoming less educated. So in a world that is rapidly becoming more complex, complexifying at a faster rate than ever, the IQ data suggests that the average American adult, for the first time in American history, is getting less intelligent. And specifically, education quality is being examined as a possible cause. What's the final verdict? If we just look at test scores, at best, it looks like for the last 50 years, Americans have been pretty much staying about the same. According to our test scores, we're stagnating. But test scores might not tell us everything. We do have more college graduates than ever before, and that's something, right? So let's look at graduation rates and the average number of years Americans spend in school. These are also a big deal. Look at the correlation between the number of years average adults spend in school in a country and the average income in that country. That is a strong trend line. And it means that the more years a population spends in school, the richer the country generally is. Also, check out the relationship between the average number of years people spend in school and the democracy index in that country. The more years a population spends in school, the more democratic that country tends to be. So it seems important. And here I do have some better news, maybe, sort of. In the past 50 years, there have been some increases in the percent of Americans graduating from high school and from college, especially for women. And this could be our first evidence of real progress for adults. That is good news. And again, it would be great news if we ignored the rest of the 20th century. Because here's the increase in graduation rates for the first part of the 20th century, both high school and college. See if you can spot the difference. The baby boomers clearly spent a lot more time in school than the silent generation, who were a lot better educated than the greatest generation. And they were way better educated than the generations that came before them, etc. But nobody since the baby boomers has become much more educated than they were. Although there's been a bit of improvement in the last 50 years, when we compare it to the progress before 50 years ago, it's just not as impressive, especially not for boys. I mean, for real, what happened to men right here? Now we're looking at the average number of years Americans spent in school by gender. And while it still kind of trickles up for women, not so much for men. You got great progress, and then bam, almost no progress at all for 50 years. What? And for women too, even though there's been progress, it's just nothing like the progress that happened for prior generations. And if you combine that with what we just learned about the IQs, that were going up here, but are going down here for both men and for women, you start to get a little insecure about that glimmer of hope we just had. Because if there are more college graduates, but the average IQ is not going up anymore, the average IQ of Americans with college degrees should be declining. And that is exactly what's happening. We're finding that same trend with literacy as well. College graduates today don't have the same literacy skills as college graduates did 50 years ago. Thanks to something called grade inflation, it's more possible than ever to get a college degree without having college-level skills. For example, between 1992 and 2003, the percent of college graduates who read at the 5th grade level or lower rose 5 percentage points, from 12% to 17%. It's possible that the college degree is becoming more and more detached from actual education. So the American history of education could be summed up like this. For 200 years, we know that America was becoming more complex as it transitioned from an agricultural nation into the world's leading industrial powerhouse. And during that time, we also know that it was steadily improving its popular education in very meaningful and significant ways. Some kind of indicator was always trending clearly towards better and better education. The percent of kids enrolled in primary school, literacy rate among women, the average number of years Americans spent in school, African American literacy rates, high school graduation rates, IQ test scores, college graduation rates, the percent of students spending more than 3 to 5 months out of the year in school. But then 50 years ago, it became suddenly possible to question whether any educational progress was being made at all. From looking at the test scores and the graduation rates, it seems like the best we could say is that education since the 1970s has been either holding steady or rising slowly. But we didn't stop becoming a more complex society 50 years ago. Just like the first 200 years, the USA is still a rapidly complexifying nation. In the grand scheme of things, this means that education progress has become decoupled from rising complexity. They're no longer moving together. And even if this is not something that gets talked about much in the media, Many academics understand that stagnating education in a complexifying society is a recipe for rising inequality. And that's why prominent social scientists say things like this.
So we've moved to a period of slower education growth and much less broadly shared prosperity. We've done this before in periods of rising inequality. We rapidly expanded education, and today we face similar challenges. And the big puzzle is, why have we seen this large slowdown in education?
And that's a good question. Why? What the heck happened right here, just as the baby boomers were becoming adults? Did the baby boomers break American educational progress? Was it the hippies after all? That's actually a really nice clickbaity title that I will file away for later, if I ever get some answers to that question. Sadly, there's no scientific consensus about why education progress came to a halt in the 1970s. But some other things that also changed in the 70s are obviously related. One thing that also changed in the 1970s could have to do with money. Before the 1970s, America used to spend more and more of its money on public schools. In 1900, Americans spent 1% of all their money on public education. By 1975, that figure had risen to 4.5% of all of our money. That's a big leap in 75 years. It's especially impressive since that hasn't budged since the 1970s. In fact, today we spend about 4% of our money on public education. So we stopped spending a higher percent of our money on education in the 1970s. That could be part of the answer. But probably more to the point, we also stopped doing new and important things in the 1970s. Like actual structural changes. The ones that came before the 70s were impressive. Making primary schools free for the first time in history, building over 20,000 new public high schools in 40 years, making child labor illegal, extending the minimum school year from 3 months to 9 months in poor communities, making sure all teachers were college educated instead of sometimes basically children with 8th grade educations. Black communities fought for and won the right to build high schools that black children could attend. Women won the right to go to college. Big reforms happened between 1770 and 1970. But really, what has changed since? How have we tackled and restructured educational privilege since then? How have any important barriers that prevent some children from becoming educated been removed? Can you think of something? Because I can't. Not on that level. And why should there be any educational progress if we're not doing anything new and different? So why did we stop? Is this because there's just nothing left to change? No, of course not. Picture a future highly advanced society, let's say 1,000 years in the future. They might invest so much and so skillfully into the healthy development of each child's brain that we would seem like a semi-literate, barely educated society to them. Instead of spending 4% of all their money on public education, they might invest 30% of all their money into future generations. A truly advanced society would seem as educationally extravagant and excessive to us as our modern public education systems would seem to people living 1,000 years ago. They might do crazy things like provide tutoring for all the children instead of teaching them in classrooms, starting when they're babies. Check out this video for an idea of what that might lead to. They might make sure that every child has a strong social support system. Summer breaks might be a time for children to set off with their community's tutors and explore the galaxy, studying absolutely anything they are interested in, with the assistance of mentors and guides who have been better educated than anybody alive today. They might pay as much attention to the non-cognitive and emotional development of children as they would pay to their intellectual development, maybe even more. Maybe in the future there will be some form of counseling or play therapy every single day for all children. Who knows? Trying to predict what a society would do if it was far more educationally advanced than ours is kind of like people 1,000 years ago trying to predict what education might be like today. All I know for sure is that we're nowhere near the end of the limits of what is possible. We're only at the limits of what we can imagine, of what seems reasonable and possible to our culture right now. We're at the limits of what we can do with a model of schooling that was a better fit for 100 years ago. And in that sense, we're exactly like the Chinese and the Italians, the Dutch and the British were when they stagnated. If a far more advanced society were to study our education system and their history books, it would probably feel pretty similar to how we might look back at the Chinese Song period, or the Italian Renaissance, or the Dutch Republic. They might be impressed with what we accomplished, but then they'd wonder, why in the world did they stop there? Clearly, earlier educational advancements had done good things for them. Why not keep a good thing going? They might ask, what was so special about that education system that made them think anything beyond this is excessive and unnatural? They'd see us more clearly than we do as just one more in a long string of cultures that at one point became the most educated culture in the world, but then eased off of the whole idea of new educational innovations and started to stagnate. China, Italy, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, and now the USA. We just lost our momentum, like so many that came before, which is a dangerous thing to do in a rapidly complexifying world. If you know the history of what happened in these places after education started to stagnate, or just to make slow progress, then you know that this is not a very nice pattern to become a part of. It's a pattern with rises and falls, glory days and decay. Still, there is power in recognizing that you're a part of a pattern. You can study that pattern and learn what general kinds of things we can expect now that we're a part of it. And that's the kind of thing this channel is for. Like and subscribe and comment for insights into the deeper why that comes from looking through the education lens.